USA, Venezuela.
How do you lock a country?
Venezuela,
A country that should never have become poor.
A country sitting on one of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth.
A country that, on paper, should have been powerful, wealthy, and influential.
And yet, for years, Venezuela has been associated with shortages, hyperinflation, mass migration, and economic collapse.
This contradiction forces us to ask a difficult question.
how does a country like this end up here?
How does a nation with so much natural wealth lose control over its future?
Today, we are not looking for a simple villain.
This is not a story of heroes and enemies.
This is a story about systems,
About leverage,
about pressure, and about how modern power works. This is the story of the United States and Venezuela.
and this is the story of how a country gets locked.
Everything begins with oil.
Oil is not just a commodity.
Oil is power.
It fuels economies, armies, transportation, industry, and global influence.
For decades, Venezuela's oil defined its position in the world.
Oil money paid for public services.
Oil money shaped politics. Oil money replaced long-term economic planning.
And slowly, oil stopped being a blessing and became a dependency.
Other sectors weakened.
Agriculture declined. Industry failed to modernize.
The economy became narrow.
Fragile. When oil prices were high, the system appeared to work.
When prices fell or pressure increased, the cracks became impossible to ignore.
This is where vulnerability enters the story.
A country dependent on one resource is not free. It is exposed. And exposure invites leverage.
This is where the United States becomes a central actor.
The United States does not need to control territory to exert power.
It controls systems.
The global financial system runs largely through U.S. institutions.
The dollar dominates trade.
Major banks follow U.S. regulations. Insurance companies, shipping firms, and energy markets are deeply tied to American influence.
This means that when the United States applies pressure, it does not need to act directly. It adjusts the environment. Sanctions are not walls. They are friction. They slow movement. They increase risk. They raise costs. You can still trade,
But fewer people want to trade with you.
You can still sell oil,
but payments get delayed, blocked, or questioned.
You can still move goods, but insurance disappears.
Shipping becomes expensive.
Partners step back.
The system does not stop instantly.
it suffocates gradually.
For Venezuela, this meant that oil remained underground, but revenue stopped flowing normally.
Without revenue, governments lose flexibility.
They cannot import enough goods.
They cannot stabilize currency.
They cannot maintain infrastructure. But again, this is only half the story.
Because external pressure alone does not destroy a country.
Internal decisions matter just as much.
Over time, Venezuela faced serious internal challenges.
Economic mismanagement reduced efficiency.
Institutions weakened.
Trust evaporated.
Investment disappeared.
Production capacity fell.
Refineries deteriorated.
Skilled workers left.
Engineers, technicians, professionals, gone.
This is one of the most damaging effects of long-term crisis.
When people leave, knowledge leaves.
And once knowledge leaves, recovery becomes much harder.
The economy entered a feedback loop. Less production led to less income. Less income worsened living conditions. Worsening conditions pushed more people to leave.
Each cycle made the next one faster and deeper.
At this point, the crisis stopped being theoretical.
It became personal.
Money lost meaning.
Prices changed daily, sometimes hourly. Savings vanished. People adapted, but adaptation came at a cost.
Informal markets expanded.
Barter returned.
Survival replaced growth.
This is when a country truly becomes locked.
Not when borders close. Not when tanks roll in. But when options disappear. The government had fewer choices. Businesses had fewer paths.
Citizens had fewer futures.
Meanwhile, the geopolitical standoff hardened. For the United States, sanctions became a strategic tool. A way to apply pressure without direct conflict. A method to influence political outcomes.
For Venezuela, resistance became a matter of sovereignty. Backing down risked losing control.
Holding firm meant absorbing pain. Both sides became trapped in their own logic. And when systems collide, compromise becomes rare. Venezuela attempted workarounds. Oil moved through alternative routes.
Transactions became opaque.
Deals shifted into gray zones. But shadow systems are inefficient. They reduce income. They increase corruption risks. They limit long-term planning. The country survived, but survival is not progress. Years passed. Millions left the country. Entire families scattered across borders. A nation exported its people instead of its products. And this is where the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. Behind every statistic is a decision. Behind every migration number is a family. This is the hidden price of locked systems. But there is one more layer to this story. Because locking a country does not only affect its economy, it reshapes its society. When survival becomes the main objective, long-term thinking disappears. People stop planning for the future. They focus on the next day, the next week, the next meal. Education suffers. Health systems weaken. Institutions lose authority. And slowly, trust erodes. Trust in money. Trust in leadership. Trust in tomorrow. This erosion is invisible at first. But it is one of the most powerful forces in any crisis. Because once trust is gone, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Even when conditions improve, people hesitate. They have learned that stability can vanish overnight. This psychological lock can last longer than any sanction. Another important element is time. Sanctions and pressure are often designed to force quick change. But countries do not move quickly. Political systems resist. Power structures harden. Elites adapt. What was meant to be temporary becomes permanent. And over time, pressure stops being leverage. It becomes the new normal. This is exactly where Venezuela found itself. A country adapting not to growth, but to restriction. Not to opportunity, but to limitation. And adaptation under pressure always favors those closest to power.
Black markets emerge.
Parallel economies grow. Informal networks replace formal systems.
The economy does not disappear.
It transforms.
But this transformation is unequal.
Those with access survive.
Those without fall behind.
This widens inequality, deepens resentment, and further destabilizes society.
Meanwhile, the international narrative simplifies. Headlines reduce complex systems to slogans.
Blame becomes convenient.
Nuance disappears.
But reality remains complicated, because unlocking a country is far more difficult than locking it.
Once systems are disconnected, reconnecting them requires trust.
And trust requires time. Banks must believe payments will be honored.
Companies must believe contracts will be respected.
People must believe effort will be rewarded.
These beliefs cannot be imposed.
They must be rebuilt.
And rebuilding is slow.
This is why even partial relief does not instantly fix anything.
Because damage accumulates.
Infrastructure decays.
Human capital disperses.
Institutions lose memory.
Recovery is not a switch. It is a process. And that process is fragile. There is also a global lesson here.
Because Venezuela is not isolated. It exists within a broader system of power.
A system where access matters more than ownership.
Where control flows through rules, not borders. In this system, countries are not conquered.
They are constrained.
Their choices are shaped.
Their options narrowed.
Their futures negotiated.
This is the reality of modern geopolitics.
And it raises an uncomfortable question.
If this can happen to a country with vast natural resources,
what does that say about others?
The answer is unsettling. No country is immune. Because wealth without resilience is fragile.
And power without diversification is vulnerable.
Venezuela's story shows what happens when dependence meets pressure.
When systems close.
When alternatives disappear. It shows that locking a country does not require invasion.
Only patience. Patience to wait as systems tighten.
As margins shrink.
As options fade.
And eventually, as survival replaces ambition.
This is why the most dangerous crises are not sudden.
They are slow. They unfold quietly. They normalize dysfunction.
They exhaust resistance.
By the time the world notices, the lock is already in place.
So when we look at Venezuela today, we are not just seeing a country in crisis.
We are seeing the outcome of a long process, a sequence of decisions, a collision of systems,
and a reminder
that in the modern world,
power does not always destroy.
Sometimes it restricts,
and restriction over time can be just as devastating. So when we ask, how do you lock a country?
The answer is not dramatic. You don't lock the land.
You lock the systems that keep it alive.
And once those systems are locked, unlocking them is far more difficult than anyone expects.
Thank you for staying until the end.
If you want to keep understanding how global power really works,
subscribe for more. There is another dimension that is often overlooked.
Because when a country is locked for a long time,
a new generation grows up inside the lock. Children are born into limitation.
Young people come of age without opportunity. Their expectations are shaped by scarcity, not possibility.
This changes behavior.
Risk-taking disappears.
Entrepreneurship fades.
Innovation slows. Why invest effort when the system does not respond? This silent resignation is one of the deepest consequences of prolonged crisis, and it rarely makes headlines.
Another effect is normalization.
What once felt unacceptable becomes routine.
Shortages become expected. Power cuts become ordinary.
Instability becomes familiar. And when instability feels normal,
Urgency disappears.
this is dangerous. Because societies that adapt too well to dysfunction
Stop demanding change.
They learn to survive inside the problem, instead of solving it.
This is how long-term stagnation takes root.
At the same time, political language hardens.
Every issue becomes ideological.
Every criticism becomes a threat.
Every alternative becomes suspicious.
Polarization replaces discussion. And once polarization dominates,
Compromise becomes betrayal.
this dynamic benefits extremes.
It punishes moderation. And it traps the entire system in place. Internationally, the picture becomes equally rigid.
Sanctions remain.
Diplomacy freezes.
Expectations lower.
Over time, fewer actors invest energy in resolution.
Because locked situations are exhausting.
They drain attention.
They consume resources.
They offer little reward. So the world moves on, and the country remains where it is.
Locked.
Another critical element is credibility. When a country is cut off from global systems for too long,
Its credibility erodes.
even if policies change, even if leadership shifts, even if reforms are announced, the world hesitates. Because memory matters. Markets remember defaults.
Banks remember losses.
Companies remember broken contracts. Reputation, once damaged, recovers slowly. This is why unlocking a country requires more than political decisions. It requires rebuilding confidence across countless invisible relationships. And that takes time. Sometimes decades. This leads to a painful paradox. The longer a country is locked, the harder it becomes to unlock it. Pressure creates damage. Damage reduces trust. Lack of trust justifies continued pressure. The cycle reinforces itself. This is not unique to Venezuela. We have seen variations of this pattern across different regions and eras, different ideologies, different resources, same mechanics, which tells us something important. This is not about one country. It is about how power operates in a connected world. In this world, access is everything. Access to markets, access to capital, access to technology, access to trust. Lose access, and even sovereignty loses meaning. Because independence without connectivity is isolation. And isolation is expensive. This reality forces uncomfortable choices. Governments must decide whether resistance is worth the cost. Populations must decide whether endurance is sustainable. And external powers must decide whether pressure is achieving its goals. or merely freezing a situation in place? There are no easy answers. Every option carries consequences. This is why long-term geopolitical conflicts rarely end cleanly. They fade, they shift, they transform, but they leave scars. In Venezuela's case, the scars are visible everywhere. In infrastructure that has aged too quickly, in institutions that lost continuity, in communities fractured by migration. Reversing this damage is possible. But it requires alignment, internal reform, external engagement, mutual credibility. Miss one element, and the process stalls. This is why short-term optimism often fails. Announcements create headlines, but systems move slowly. Unlocking requires patience, coordination, and realism. It also requires acknowledging mistakes on all sides. Without that, history repeats, and repetition is the enemy of progress. There is another lesson here, one that goes beyond Venezuela. In the modern world, power is rarely absolute. It is conditional. It flows through systems that can be adjusted, delayed, or denied. This makes power subtle, but also pervasive. Countries are no longer defeated in a single moment. They are managed, contained, restricted, shaped. This does not always lead to collapse. Sometimes it leads to something worse. Permanent limitation. A future that never fully opens. This is why the question matters. How do you lock a country? Because understanding the mechanism is the first step to resisting it. And because awareness creates leverage for policymakers, for citizens, for societies. Venezuela's story is still unfolding. It is not finished. The lock is not unbreakable. But breaking it requires more than pressure or defiance. It requires rebuilding systems, restoring trust, and reimagining the future. That is the hardest task of all. Because after years of restriction, hope itself becomes fragile. And restoring hope, or reopening banks, hope depends on belief. Belief that effort matters, that tomorrow can be better than today. That systems will respond. Without that belief, no reform survives. So as we look at Venezuela, we are not just analyzing a country. We are examining a warning. A reminder of how modern power works. How systems constrain. How choices narrow. And how easily a nation can drift. From potential to paralysis. This is why these stories matter. Not to sensationalize suffering, not to simplify blame, but to understand reality, because the world we live in is built on systems, and those systems can either sustain countries or slowly lock them in place. Understanding that difference may be one of the most important lessons of our time. Thank you for staying with this analysis. And if you want to continue exploring how global power, economics, and systems really work, subscribe for the next video.